So please take a look at our past talks and encourage your colleagues to do the same. And if anybody you know who wanted to see today wasn't able to attend, please let them know. And then in a few days' time, it'll go up onto our website. And in fact, most of last year's discussions are here as well, and all of this year's ones as well. Ever since we went online, they've all been recorded. For discussions and questions and answers at the end of the presentation, we use Slido. Many of you will have used that before, but if not, please just go to www.slido, that's SLIDO.com, or download the app and enter the event code, which is JCIPP, our institute, so JCIPP. And once you do that, you'll then see there'll be questions and answers questions coming through. I facilitate the questions towards the end and help Ross out. And then I always find it's best that you download the app or have Slido on your phone. That way you can watch the presentation on the big screen on your computer and do the Slido on the phone. Now, to today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Mr. Ross Taylor, AM. Ross is the current president of the Indonesia Institute, based here in Perth. He's also a past national vice president of the Australia-Indonesian Business Council and was the Australian government's commissioner to Indonesia from 2002 to 2004, based at the Australian Embassy in Jakarta. Ross has got extensive business experience, including as a senior executive with Wesfarmers Limited, and he founded and ran a phosphate fertiliser mine on Christmas Island. Great place, I love Christmas Island. I'm not completely sure, but I might have been in that role on Christmas Island when he really began to engage with Indonesia, as that mine exported over 400,000 tonnes there. And when he's not promoting Australia-Indonesian relationships, Ross finds time to be a very significant philanthropist, focusing in particular on cancer care. And he was founding president of the Cancer Wellness Centre in Cottesloe and is a past board member of Solaris Cancer Care and Breast Cancer Care in WA. In 2013, he was selected by Indonesia as Australia's presidential friend of Indonesia, and later that year he became a member of the Order of Australia, an AM, hence he is Ross Taylor AM, for his services to Australia-Indonesian relations and to his 28 years of service to charities in WA. He's very active in the media, and you can find his articles and letters in most Australian newspapers and at the Jakarta Post, and commentary on radio and TV. He's also got a very informative Twitter account, which I recommend to you. And so really there is no one better than Ross Taylor to talk to us about how Australia and WA and Australia can build better relationships with our near and very significant neighbour, Indonesia. So Ross has already given a Curtin Corner several years ago, so it's great to have him back to let us know how things are going. So Ross, over to you. Thanks very much for being our presenter today.
Thank you very much indeed, John, and I'm actually starting to feel rather important after that beautiful introduction. Firstly, if I may just say to my Indonesian friends, Bapak-bapak dan ibu-ibu, selamat sore, and as you know, nama saya Ross Taylor dari Indonesia Institute di Perth, di Australia Barat. So we really are looking forward to sharing some views with you, and certainly at the end, as John's already indicated, I'd be very happy to answer any questions. There's quite a number of people viewing today that obviously are very important to me, but I would just, if you don't mind, John, I'd like to acknowledge Major General John Hartley AO, who's amongst many other things, is the former Deputy Chief of Australia's Armed Forces, and he's tuning in today. So John, it's really great to have you here. Everybody, just before we start to talk about Indonesia, the country and the people, just so that we can just get this out of the way, I thought I'd just give you quickly an update with regard to COVID-19, which seems to be on everyone's mind at the moment. So very briefly, for your information, Indonesia has recorded officially about 1.8 million cases. It's generally considered that's pretty well understated quite dramatically. 1.79 to be precise, that's the official number, with 1.65 million recoveries and about 50,000 deaths. For those that love Bali, and there's a lot of us, they've had 47,000 cases, 44,500 cases have recovered, with about 1,400 deaths. So that's just an update is what's happening with COVID. The two vaccines at the moment are Sinovac from China and also AstraZeneca. Certainly in Bali at the moment, it seems to be working very well, and the number of cases is certainly dropping. So that's just a brief look at COVID. I'll touch on that during the discussion, and I'll try and just process what I'd like to say to you in the next 30 minutes, John, and that will then give everybody hopefully some time to ask some questions. Bearing in mind there are people viewing today that perhaps are not or have not been as intimately involved in Indonesia as many of the other or you other people that are listening. So if you can just bear with me for a moment, and I thought I'd just paint a picture about Indonesia, the country Indonesia, the people, and how Australians perceive them. I suppose as I've gone through the many years in which I've been involved with Indonesia in recent times, I love sitting around a dinner table and just saying to people, when I say Indonesia, can you tell me what words come to mind? Now, this is not scientific, but I thought I'd just share them with you, and they're not probably overly surprising. But the most common ones that I've recorded over the last 8-9 years are these. Bali, no surprise, Bintang beer, terrorists, boat people, asylum seekers. Chappelle Corby still gets a mention, as does Myron Sukumaran and Andrew Chan, the two drug runners who were executed some time ago. And of course, the other very common one is just simply the word Muslims. So that's just a snapshot of what comes to mind when people think about Indonesia. Even more interesting is if you look through the annual Lowy Institute, a highly respected organisation that does a snapshot of views about Indonesia and other countries. It's interesting to see over a number of years, generally speaking, about 30% of Australians see that Bali is an independent country rather than a province of Indonesia. About 52% of Australians do not realise that Indonesia operates as a democracy, and in fact, a very vibrant democracy. 68% of Australians believe that Indonesia has a media that is controlled by the government, which is an amazing statistic, because I think one of the problems Indonesia does have is, in fact, the media in Indonesia probably is too free, and that's leading to problems in terms of misinformation. So it's a bit of a paradox there. And I think disturbingly, even in last year's report, the Lowy Institute reported that some 64% of Australians, and bearing in mind this includes prospective and future business people, have a reasonably high level or any level of distrust of Indonesians. In fact, rating them alongside people from Egypt and Russians in terms of people they trust the least. And I wanted to put that statistic to you, because one of the great arguments our Indonesia Institute has argued to our federal government and to the various business councils, along with the signing that many of you would have heard about of what we call IA-CIPA, which was the trade agreement last year that was signed. Very exciting story about a free trade agreement between our two countries. But we do ask the question of the federal government that if in fact 64% of all Australians have levels of distrust of Indonesians, and this includes business people, surely that presents a really big challenge for us. So that's a snapshot of how Australians see Indonesia. What is the reality? Well, it's actually quite different. Indonesia is a country of 71 million people. Around 95 million of those people are under 30 years of age. 10 years ago, the usage of electronic devices such as mobile phones was around about 8%. Today, it's over 85%. And Indonesia rates in the top 3 for both Twitter and Facebook. And I think it's number 2 in the world now for Instagram. So immediately we can see how Indonesians are embracing technology. What that should mean for a country like Australia is one word: opportunity. As I've already mentioned with regard to Indonesia, I think the other important factor, as I've already touched on, is the incredible transformation from the days of President Suharto to today, when we have a very vibrant democracy running in Indonesia. And I might add that if you look at the cabinet of President Jokowi, women play a very important role, and a very senior role in his cabinet. I've already touched on the media. As I said, in some respects, sometimes it's a bit too free. The other reality, of course, is Bali is indeed part of Indonesia. I think the other important statistic, of course, is that in the next 10 years, all the leading Pricewaterhouse, the Boston Consulting Group, all agree that in the next 10 years, Indonesia will become the 4th largest nation by GDP in the world. So it will have a GDP that's bigger than Australian. It'll have an armed forces that's bigger than Australia, and it already has a population that is much bigger than Australia. So the question is then, people sometimes say to me, who are Indonesians and what are they like? And like most people that love Indonesia, there's only one answer to that is, look, I don't really know. I can't answer that question. Because in fact, when you talk about who are Indonesians, you really have to break that down a bit in terms of where you are. Because if you are in Java, of course, you will deal with Javanese people, predominantly a Muslim population in Java. If you go to Sulawesi, we have the famous Bugis people. And if you go to Sumatra, home to many Batak people. And I can assure you, if you can't tell the difference between Javanese people and the Bataks and the Bugis, you wait until you go there and work there. You'll learn very quickly. It's extremely diverse. And of course, then we have our Balinese, which is a Hindu, a Balinese form of Hindu. And then as you progress to Eastern Indonesia, a more Christian-based society. And speaking of being a Christian-based society, Indonesia is not a Muslim country. It's a democracy of which 90% of the population are Muslim. But having said that, it's an interesting statistic to see that Indonesia has more Christians in Indonesia than we do people in Australia, at around about 26 million people. And when you think that, of course, there are more Catholics in Indonesia than there are in Australia as well. So it's a very, very diverse country, and hence the absolute fascination. And also Indonesians, despite their diversity, are a very community-orientated nation. What are they like as a people? Just in my own view, I think what Australians find when they do go and live there is that, generally speaking, Indonesians are very Asian in that they are very respectful. I've already indicated they are very religious, predominantly Islamic, but they form all religions. And it's very interesting how they perceive religion in society. It is quite common when Australian business people go to Indonesia for the first time, they'll find themselves in a taxi. It is not unusual for a taxi driver, if they can speak English, to turn to you and get into discussion. And as part of that discussion, they may indeed ask you, what is your religion? We don't do that in Australia, but in Indonesia, they do. And I think the mistake we often make is not wanting to offend them. A number of my friends have often said, I just tell the taxi driver, I don't have a religion. And I've got to say, generally speaking, for Indonesians, for you to tell them they don't have a religion, they find that very strange indeed. Whereas if you say, I'm a Christian, that's absolutely fine. Because their faith with God is so strong. As long as you have a connection to God, that's absolutely fine. So it's one of those little nuanced cultural mistakes that we sometimes make. Indonesians are very nationalistic. You know, they were ruled by the Japanese, but more importantly by the Dutch for over 300 years. And sometimes Australians find it a bit hard when they see acts of nationalism taking place over core issues in Indonesia, forgetting, of course, that national pride, if I do say so, I think is more important to everyday Indonesians than we are in Australia, for no other reason than that they have been dispossessed of their country, they have been occupied, and they really fiercely defend their independence. Indonesians are funny. Once you get to, I think Vicky is in our audience today, she would only be happy to tell you as an Indonesian speaker that once you can communicate with everyday Indonesians, they have a wonderful sense of humour, great humour indeed, and they love a joke. If I can digress for a moment, I'm sure many of you would remember when we had a major international incident where the wife of the then President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Ibu Ani, had her phone tapped by Australian ASIO authorities, or our Signals Directorate. I think you'll recall that. It caused a bit of an international incident. And this joke's not really funny, but it gives you an indication of what Indonesians are like, because within hours of this uproar about the bugging by Australia of the Indonesian president's wife, across Twitter, the word was out that in actual fact, it was all a mistake, that the Australian authorities were indeed listening in on the discussions for the president's wife, and they had good reason, because they had transcripts of records of her talking to Indonesia's defence minister 4 days before the bugging, talking about the purchase of 2 subs. And in actual fact, when the bugging stopped, what they failed to do was to listen in long enough to hear the discussion about these subs, when Ibu Ani told the Defence Minister, please make sure his staff brings the first sub with pepperoni, and the second sub is just got to be a vegetarian because she doesn't eat meat. Of course, they were referring to an order from Subway. This is the sort of almost Aussie, funny, weird sense of humour in the face of a very, very serious issue. And it says something about the nature of these amazing people. So in summary, Australians generally, apart from Bali, they view Indonesia, sadly, with a degree of arrogance and suspicion. And what really worries me is that Indonesians reciprocate a view back to us of basically one of ambivalence. And I think that's a great shame, because it really demonstrates that we've not done enough to build those people-to-people connections for a nation that is so vital for Australia. So why do we have such a distorted view of Indonesia? There's many more well-qualified people than I to give their own thoughts on this, but I think a lot of it is dictated by, firstly, what my friend Colin Brown from Griffith University once described as the tyranny of closeness. You know, when you live close to someone, you tend to peek over their fence and into their backyard, and that inevitably causes problems. And the Australian media and politicians have used Indonesia very effectively over many years for domestic purposes, as the Indonesians do back to us. And that's just part of a democracy, but it tends to build a distorted perception of what Indonesia is like. And I mentioned earlier on some of those core issues, ranging from hangings to, dare I say, West Papua, and a range of other issues that form, I think, a fairly negative picture of Indonesia. What we don't hear, of course, is about the good things that they are doing. So having said that, why is Indonesia so important to Australia? Because really we don't pay it much attention. I've already mentioned to you that it will become the 4th largest economy by 2050. that presents a huge opportunity to go to Indonesia instead of trying to compete. They look north for their economic development to Korea, Japan, Singapore, China. China will become the largest investor in Indonesia, throwing Singapore out probably by early next year. So they're the fourth largest economy by 2050. That presents an enormous opportunity for Australia to go to Indonesia, perhaps a little bit differently, instead of trying to compete with these great northern countries. But by going to say to Indonesia, look, but Jokowi as president, we're a small nation. We're only 24 million people. But with respect, with great graciousness, we're a very smart first world country with huge advances in medical, in technology, in education, and a whole suite of factors that as a small nation that we can support you, Indonesia, on your move up the ladder to number 4 in the world by 2050. We can provide so much of the things that you need to help you get there, and unashamedly, we would like to hold on to your coattails and come along for the ride. That's okay, because once you do that, you establish what I call the basis for a real partnership. So what else makes Indonesia very important to us? Certainly in the areas of defence, there is no question. You would have had lots of discussion and read a lot about China now becoming very active in the South China Sea. There is no doubt what China's intentions are in this whole region regarding expanding its interests. So Indonesia plays a very critical role, apart from the fact that so much of our overseas exports pass through Indonesian waters. But together, Australia and Indonesia really present quite a strong bloc, along with probably India, in terms of presenting a coordinated approach to dealing with China. And Indonesia is not that different from Australia in regards to China. Both countries rely on China enormously for their economic benefit, yet both countries have irritations with China. Indonesia certainly does, as does Australia. The approach that Indonesia has taken in dealing with China as compared to Australia is another story, but suffice to say they have taken a very different role. And it's interesting to see at the moment China are working very hard to cultivate a much closer relationship with Indonesia, despite the fact that for many Indonesians, there is this inherent distrust and dislike of ethnic Chinese within the country. Notwithstanding that, the relationship between Indonesia and China is becoming far more closer. Indonesia is not silly. President Jokowi knows what the long game is that China are playing here. But I think what it does say to Australia is that we should not underestimate the importance of maintaining this really close relationship with Indonesia. Apart from defence, our Australian Federal Police and the Polri, which is the police of Indonesian National Police, in terms of anti-terrorism, have worked very closely in close partnerships. Australians have no idea of how many more bombings were planned and were about to be executed that we never heard about because of information passed from the Australian Federal Police through to the Balinese authorities, resulted in raids, mostly in East Java, of groups of would-be terrorists. So we work very closely with the Indonesian authorities. And also, as I've already mentioned, both countries have a very important strategic role in the ASEAN region. So how is the relationship with Indonesia anyway? And here is what I would like to put to you is an amazing paradox. As I've already indicated, on a government-to-government basis, defence, policing, even in terms of the Electoral Commission that help run these incredible electoral process of 270 million people, less the children, needing to vote. Australia plays a great role there. We have very good relations in business-to-business relationships, and also with NGOs and cultural and community groups. So there is this very broad relationship with Indonesia that I would say today is as good as it has been for many years. So what's the problem? What is the paradox? Well, the paradox is, I mentioned that's a very strong, broad relationship. It's very broad, but it's enormously shallow. So when I talk about those groups where we enjoy this so-called good relationship, that probably equates to about 3% of the Australian population. Sadly, once you go beneath that and look down how the rest of Australia perceives Indonesia, you run into the problems to which I've already referred. And I think that lies the challenge that we face in terms of the strategic relationship and the business relationship. We need to get our general populations to know each other a lot better. And for some reason, we have a political mental block about doing that. So what sorts of things annoy Indonesia mostly about Australia, despite their overall ambivalence about us? Because after all, we are a small country of 24 million people, a long way away. And in the meantime, 100 million Indonesians are more focused on getting a meal for their kids and getting their children educated at school. So what are the things at a political level that really annoy Indonesians? What do we do that stops this development of these important people-to-people relations? Let me just share a few with you. The most controversial, I suppose, would be if you go back to 2013, where Tony Abbott introduced the turn back the boat policy. And I have to say, it was very effective. And from Australia's perspective, it was very successful. Bearing in mind, these asylum seekers were from very different countries, but also many of them were Hazara people from Afghanistan who were fleeing a war in which we and America were involved in. These people, along with Sri Lankans, and there were others from the Middle East, Iraq, Australia, and it was a political win for Tony Abbott, make no mistake about it. He took the gamble that if he turned back the boats to Indonesia, that Indonesia would not react, causing a major diplomatic incident. It was really rolling the dice. He did it, and for various reasons, including domestic politics in Indonesia, the matter was kept fairly quiet up there, and he got away with it. But I have to say is that in doing so, it has left something like 13,500 refugees, including over 7,000 Afghanis, the Hazara people, basically destitute along with their kids in Indonesia, where today, in 2021, these people have no access to medical, no access to education, no access to a job, no access to welfare payments, and no access to homes. They are basically destitute, and Australia has wiped their hands of the so-called problem of these refugees. And I don't want to get into the politics of that, but I think in terms of diplomatic relations, I think it was a bit rude of Australia to say that these are not Indonesians wanting to come to Australia. These are people that were in Indonesia for no other reason that they wanted to transit to Australia to seek a new life. And we just have basically said, Indonesia, here you are, you can have them back, they're your problem. And Indonesia is very graceful. They've never really commented on this. The diplomats don't talk about it. But the underlying issue is, I think with some justification, very annoyed about that. When Indonesians want to come to visit us and have holidays here, let me rephrase that. When people from Singapore, Malaysia or Brunei want to come here for a holiday, this is in putting COVID to one side. The way they do that, they can jump online, $20 visa fee, and they get a visa online. If you are from Indonesia, even today, and you want to come to Perth, for example, and bring your children for a holiday, let's say mum and dad and 2 kids, you need to go and apply. You can apply online or through an agent. That will cost you a non-refundable $560 for the 4 people. You then have to complete a 15-page questionnaire for each member of your family, including your teenage daughter, who has to answer questions including to her, have you been involved in pedophilia and have you been involved in acts of genocide? We then wonder why last year in 2019, before COVID struck, we wonder why here in Perth, for example, we had from Singapore and Malaysia respectively between 120 to 130,000 tourists come and visit us. In that same year from Indonesia, we had 12,500 people. That is absolutely shocking. And the economic loss to Australia by us blocking Indonesians to come here, not only for tourism, which has cost us dearly, but in terms of building that people-to-people relationship, has really cost us very greatly. I think the other thing that I think they find really strange, as do I, you would have all heard about the seasonal worker program, where again, post-COVID, and we've seen what happens when we don't have our seasonal workers here in terms of picking grapes and fruit and the like. We normally have a seasonal worker program whereby we allow people from the Pacific Islands and Timor-Leste to come here during harvest time to help us conduct our harvest. They play a critical role, as has been proven late last year and early this year because of COVID. Indonesia finds it very strange that that has not been extended to include agricultural workers from Indonesia. Many of them, particularly those from Bali, are very experienced workers. They speak English. And even during COVID, have been devastated economically and could have provided an enormous source, subject to COVID clearance, of workers, and they're hard workers and polite and respectful workers that we could have used. And Indonesia just often wonders why that program can't be extended. They also wonder why qualified nurses, for example, in Indonesia cannot come here for 2 years and work in aged care and also in childcare. Both these areas are screaming out for qualified people, but particularly in the elderly, with the elderly, like where my mum was, to try and get people that are not only qualified like the Indonesians would be, but who have a nature that is extremely respectful and caring for the elderly. So we ask ourselves, why can't we have such a program? And I think that's a great disappointment, because all these factors that I've just indicated to you are ways in which we can build these people-to-people links, and we can actually get to know each other. If we did all these things, we would see a demand for Australians and West Australians who could speak Bahasa Indonesia. Our Indonesian language is collapsing because there is no benefit in it for students to learn Indonesian. Business don't acknowledge it, they don't recognise it, and we have this drop in the learning of Indonesian at a time where it should be going the other way. This all revolves around building these people-to-people relations. So in the time I've got left, I just wanted to say to you, look, let's look to the future. What do we see happening up in Indonesia that will be interest to Australia in the next year, apart from, of course, COVID-19? On a business front, as I've already mentioned, IA-CEPA, the trade agreement, already we're starting to see from Australia now some vegetables, fruit that were previously subject to quite high tariffs now being fed into Indonesian supermarkets, which is very exciting, because under IA-CEPA now they can go in duty-free. We also want to use IA-CEPA not just to, as I often say to people, sell stuff to Indonesia. We need to use IA-CEPA to start to develop these partnerships whereby, whether you're talking about live cattle or education or technology, whereby we can form partnerships where both parties have skin in the game, whereby we build relationships, we can make and develop products in Indonesia using Australian technology, whereby together we can then re-export those products to Asia and also to the Middle East. That's where the real benefit of partnerships between two strange neighbours can actually prove a huge benefit. So I think trade's going to be a really big issue. I think the relationship, to which I've already mentioned, between Australia and China and Australia and Indonesia is going to be very, very critical. We, more than ever now, need each other. Indonesia needs Australia, Australia needs Indonesia. We may not know each other that well as neighbours, but we have a vested interest in each other's security and strategic position in this region, and we should not underestimate that whatsoever. To those Australians that say Indonesia could potentially be a threat to Australia, someone like John Hartley, I'm sure, would tell you that that is quite fanciful. Indonesia should be a very close ally, or even closer ally than they are already. Looking ahead further, it's only now 3.5 years before the next national election in Indonesia, when President Jokowi or Joko Widodo will stand down. It's too early to predict who will be the president, but you should not rule out Prabowo Subianto, who is currently the defence minister for Indonesia, and this will be his third go at becoming president. And my own personal view is that if he stands at this stage, and things, a week is a long time in politics, but I think at this stage he could well become the next president of Indonesia. And this is someone until just recently was actually black banned from coming to Australia and also to America. So I think that will change the relationship significantly. My own personal view, though, is I think it could actually change for the better once we overcome the history of the man. What else is going to be important? I think from a West Australian aspect, I just wanted to note it's been really, really disappointing for so many people, including myself, to see the West Australian government decide to downgrade the presence of a permanent full-time trade commissioner to Indonesia, or commissioner as they now call it. That's a position I held some years back, and it can play an enormously important role in terms of diplomacy and also introducing businesses to a market that is incredibly exciting, incredibly large, but incredibly complex. And for the West Australian government to turn their back on such an important regional neighbour by downgrading that office, despite the spin that their department puts on it, that's what's happened. And they have now appointed a commissioner for ASEAN, whose previous experience is from the Lands Department, who will now look after not only Indonesia but the 9 other ASEAN countries. So I'm scratching my head how that will even work, given that the person concerned has never even been to Indonesia other than a holiday to Bali. So that's disappointing. I was fortunate to meet with Roger Cook, the Minister for State Development, which a lot of people don't realise. In addition to his health role, I met with him yesterday and I expressed that view, and I'm just really hoping that we can strengthen that relationship with Indonesia again. And from a WA perspective, particularly in East Java, whereby we have a 30-year sister state relationship with this state or province. It's a province of 45 million people. So it's double the population of Australia in one state or one province. And already we have quite a number of West Australian companies now doing business there, ranging from manufacturing to kitchenware manufacturing, to making fire lighters, to running Toby Estate coffee. So we have a lot of West Australians there, huge opportunity, but I'm not too sure whether our government has really got their head around just how important that is. So in summary, in the time I've got left, John, in the last 2 minutes, let me just simply say that I look with a high degree of positivity towards the relationship, but I think it's going to be very, very dependent on a major shift in Australia, both at a state level, as I've just explained, but more importantly at a federal level, whereby if we are really serious about moving beyond the rhetoric John, as espoused by Tony Abbott when he said we need more Jakarta and less Geneva, and also Scott Morrison last year said there is no country in Asia more important than Indonesia. Well, that's great rhetoric, but we need to demonstrate that we really mean that, and the way we need to do that, as I've already indicated, is to build these people-to-people relationships, get to know each other, form these partnerships that have already been proven by a lot of small companies that people don't even know about here in Australia very successfully. If we don't do that, I'm afraid that I think our relationship will continue to be very transactional, and they will also be, and continue to be, the strangers next door. And I certainly hope we choose to take a more progressive path in building these people-to-people relations. So, terima kasih banyak, and thank you. John, if I can just perhaps hand back to you at this stage, and thank you for listening, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ross. That was great and very informative and challenging. And so hopefully we can get some good feedback and some questions through our Slido app. So first, just remind everybody, slido.com is the app, and there's already a few questions come through, and our code is JCIPP. So Ross, a couple of different questions from different angles, really. Some are more on international relations type. So the internal relations in Indonesia to do with West Papua, for example, which is unsurprising. I mean, it's often, when you talk about how Australia sees Indonesia, it's often through those sorts of issues, and others are more on the commercial and other fronts. So I'll work our way through them. So we've got a couple of questions here. One from David about how does Australia deal with the Indonesians in order to encourage them to gracefully depart from West Papua? And there's another one about West Papua, which says, is the Indonesian military under the control of the government? And what do we make of the military's role in West Papua? And of course, previously Aceh and Timor-Leste. So the West Papua issue, a lot of the issues about Indonesia, of course, are about these issues at the periphery of the Indonesian archipelago, but of course, very important issues, probably to Indonesia as well as to some Australians. So what's the issue? How are things going on there?
Well, I think it's a very valid question, and I know that's, I think on Q&A, anyone was watching that was raised last night. What I can do is, and I do not pretend to be an expert specifically on West Papua, but let me just give you an Indonesia perspective of West Papua, not because I necessarily agree with it, but just so you can get a balanced view of how they see it. And John, I think probably the most important thing that really worries Indonesia greatly is that where anytime, in Indonesia is a huge archipelago, 17,000 islands, I've already described, very ethnic diverse. We saw in Aceh a breakaway movement there that resulted in autonomy given to people in Aceh, which was facilitated by America and the United Kingdom. What Indonesia really worry about is, and it's a bit cliche, but they worry about the balkanization of Indonesia, that there are a whole range of groups in Indonesia that would probably, if they had the chance, including Aceh, would like to break away and become, in their view, independent. And I think what really worries Indonesia, that once you let this start going, you're really starting to see the start of the breakdown of the country we call Indonesia. And this is very difficult for people that are very passionate about the people of West Papua, but if I just put my diplomatic hat on, from Australia's perspective also, the last thing that Australia would ever want strategically in this environment with China exercising huge power is to start to see more tiny, very economically dependent nations breaking up on our doorstep. It would just be probably the great nightmare for Australia. So is that a reason to allow human rights abuses? Well, of course not. President Jokowi has actually, I believe, genuinely tried very hard in Papua in recent years, in the last couple of years, that the amount of infrastructure that he's put into that region has been really quite quite phenomenal. But it does run into problems because, you know, you then have the argument, well, is he putting infrastructure in there to allow foreign companies to come in and steal the resources from us West Papuans? So in fairness to the president, whichever way he moves now, he seems to be trapped in trying to genuinely do something about it. The behaviour of the TNI and some of the armed forces, you know, I think there are questions there. You know, as I said, I don't profess to be a professional in that area, but I think the behaviour sometimes is a lot less to be desired, and it's just a real festering point. And I hate to say it, but I think that in the next 12 to 24 months, this could become quite a major issue between Australia and Indonesia. So once again, and I'm not making light of it, but once again, this will be just the next transactional problem between our two countries, which then pushes all the good things we're doing to one side. And I just want to qualify again that that's not me taking one side or the other. That's just saying this is the way it is. And one of the realities we face, unfortunately, you know, as we're seeing with China's activities, is that what's right and what's diplomatically correct often don't fit. And this is one of those.
Sure. Okay, thanks. Let's have a look at some other questions here. You actually did touch on this a little bit because I'd asked the question just to get the ball rolling, was about what's the current situation re teaching Indonesian language in schools and also universities in Australia. You said it's going badly. How badly is badly, and what can we do about that?
Yes, it's a good question. In fact, here in Western Australia, would you believe, and I don't have the exact figures, but I think in primary school, John, it's around about 250 schools are teaching Bahasa Indonesia, and I think that's fantastic. So we take a lot of heart from that. But a really weird thing happens. When you go to high school, that drops down to below 10 that quickly. And then to university, it's now down to 1. And therein lies the problem, and a lot of far more intellectual and well-versed people on the subject of language have had many discussions about this issue. I tend to be a bit more provocative by saying to them and to anyone who teaches Bahasa Indonesia, I ask them this question. Basically, if I was a young person and I'm going into university, why would I commit myself to 3 years learning an Indonesian language when I leave university? Almost no companies in the top 200 will give me any credit whatsoever for either being Asian, if I'm an Asian-born Australian, or speaking an Asian language, in particular Indonesia. So that doesn't say much about the students. It says a whole lot about business and government and how we perceive our role in Asia. And AsiaLink have just done a survey in I think last year, which showed, again, my figures are a bit rubbery, but I'm pretty close, that in terms of people with Asian literacy or understanding of Asia or have worked there on Australian boards in the top 200, it is around about 6% of company directors, and of CEOs, it's around 4%. So what that tells me, once again, despite the rhetoric, not just about Indonesia, but Australia, we have a real problem about, truthfully, you know, embracing where we are, stuck in the middle of Asia, and making that change. As more and more young Asian families are born because of multiculturalism, I think that will change, but it may come too late for us. So what I'm saying, John, is about languages. If companies changed their mindset and started to value language learning, such as Indonesian, say if we started to bring in 300,000 Indonesians here on holidays instead of 10,000, and then the tourist companies, the multiplier effect, the demand for Indonesian-speaking Australians would grow quickly. So what are those students going to do? They'll go to the university and say, I want to learn. And what are the universities going to do? They're in the business of making money these days. They've got to make money. So it's a supply and demand issue. That's not the whole problem, but it really feeds into that. So until we change the mindset in our business community, quite frankly, I think we're going to continue to struggle. And I think given the importance of Indonesia, that is not only a tragedy, It's damn right dumb.
And so just quickly following on, because I also have another question here, which sort of follows on very nicely, actually, is, and it may be beyond your field of knowledge, but how does China and Indonesia compare as places for West Australian businesses to do business, or companies to do business? I mean, because I see things often about, doing business in China and how you've got to play the long game and it can't be too transactional. There's lots of advice and other things about doing business in China because the opportunity is so great. But as there's 270 million Indonesians, you think there's some pretty good opportunities there. I mean, and are we not taking them because is it too hard to do business in Indonesia? Are the rules, is it regulated, over-regulated, makes it difficult for foreign investment, or are we just not aware of it because of the other issues you've mentioned? So what's the ease of doing business for Australians in Indonesia, maybe compared to China, which is the other obvious big country there?
It's a very good question. The ease of business in both countries, it's very complex, and that's why you need, if possible, good quality experienced commissioners that can help. But let me just say that the relationship with China, and I'm generalising, is really obviously it's absolutely dominated by iron ore, and most of our relationship with China from a business and trade perspective is very transactional. We want to sell stuff, they need to buy stuff. There's, I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically the relationship. So what we try and do then, I think in a mindset, is translate that and do that with Indonesia as well. But Indonesia doesn't really buy that sort of stuff from Australia. Their needs are quite different. So of course they were buying a very large amount of wheat from us. That's now coming, a lot of that's now coming from the Black Sea. But what I touched on earlier, John, it's an important question, is that what we need to do, we can say, there's our transactional relationship with China, that's fine. They're a fair way away from us. But right on our doorstep, we've got this country of 270 million people. Can we have the relationship working a bit differently? And I think the exciting thing about this is, unbeknown to most people, we would have at least a dozen SMEs here in Perth, and these are companies generating up to $50 million a year, right here in Perth, in Osborne Park, down in Fremantle, who years ago, and I must admit myself and others have been involved in putting this together, as I mentioned earlier, instead of trying to sell stuff to Indonesia, to actually build partnerships. I can mention one company called Simply Stainless. They decked out Optus Stadium with all the, anything stainless steel, all the bars, the fridges, the catering. It was a $10 million contract. And this is public knowledge, so I'm not talking out of school. They have an office in Osborne Park. And they 25 years ago, they were trying to sell products overseas and couldn't compete. Today, they have a model whereby they produce products here for Australia, but also they have a big operation now with their partner in Surabaya in Indonesia, where they employ about 140 people. We use technology. So all the science, the technology, the administration, marketing is all done from here, offering Australians jobs. Up in Surabaya, there's a big manufacturing plant where these products are then consolidated and built, and they export to some 45 countries from Indonesia under Australian brand. And there is another 10 companies that I can tell you about now. Even fishing lures, can you believe that? There's a company in Fremantle, Halco Fishing, have the same model. And I saw the owner of that, Ben Patrick, the other day and said, well, your little fishing lures, how many are exporting out? How many countries now? I said, it must be over 40 countries. He goes, 65. So I'm just giving you those two little examples by, if we switch our mindset from we sell, they buy, to, hey, how about we form partnerships with an eye on third-party destinations? Australia and Indonesia can do such amazing things, but we have to have that change of mindset, and we really struggle. And I think we struggle because life's been too easy. Just dig stuff up and sell it. And now people like myself are saying, you have to start thinking differently. And it's incredible. We really struggle with that concept. So there's the opportunity. Sorry to take so long, but it's
excellent. Good answer. Okay, let me just keep down here. This is another one sort of related, which is, do you think the WA government's removal of the ministerial portfolio for Asian engagement will impact on our relationship? I mean, you mentioned some of the things we've done over the last little while, the good and the bad and the indifferent. So obviously you've been in the media about this a little bit, and you've just mentioned you've met the minister. So what firstly, what does it mean internally within WA? And also, how has it been signalled and received in Indonesia, if you know and if you can say?
Sure. Just the very brief answer, and look, I won't get into the politics, but basically the Asian Engagement Minister was the Honourable Peter Tinley, who I knew very well. He just didn't appear, like he wasn't actually sacked. He disappeared when the Premier announced his portfolio shake-up. And quite frankly, that's the Premier's absolute right. He did that. The problem, as I indicated to Minister Cook with that, was that the Minister for Asian Engagement got his head chopped off. But the perception amongst all the consulates, the business community, everybody, was that was the end of Asian engagement. Where in actual fact, the portfolio was transferred to the Deputy Premier. So actually they didn't mean to do it, but they've actually elevated the portfolio. So I suggested to their department, which is acronym called JITSI, wouldn't it be a good idea very quickly if you could get out there and actually tell all the stakeholders fast that don't worry, we haven't axed Asian engagement. There's been a political thing. People in Indonesia and China, people in Asia understand about politics. They're involved in it themselves. Look, that's happened, but Asian engagement has actually been elevated, not downgraded. Well, 7.5 weeks later, the department still had not done that. And they get cross at people like me for telling them off. And so the answer is the perception now in Asia is that Western Australia had backed away from Asian engagement. And that is an absolute tragedy and a disgrace. And as I told the Minister, someone should get their head shot off for that. And quite frankly, he agreed.
Okay, that's good. Right, other things here, let's have a look. Someone just mentioned, you mentioned earlier about the Tony Abbott issue of the turning back the boats. Someone's asked about so how the refugee situation in Depok is heartbreaking, but they do know that Indonesia has permitted some skilled refugees to work. So that's, I mean, I'm not sure, you may know or may not know about what's happened to the refugees who will be like in transit, or they're stuck in Indonesia, and their situation is very poor, as you just mentioned. But is there anything happening on the Indonesian side to try and ease that load potentially?
Yeah, technically that is correct. That, there's been some informal arrangement at a local government level to allow them to get work. But let's be honest, we're talking around about $4 to $5 per day. Quite frankly, I'm a businessman. I'm not a humanitarian, by nature. I'm a businessman. But I just really question what on earth happens to these kids, 4, 5, 6, like my granddaughter, if she was there. And when I see it, when I go there, I haven't done it recently, of course, and see it firsthand, it just about breaks my heart. And I just really think that, whether we like it or not, we contributed to the Afghan war. We were involved in that process. These people were trying to escape. They came to Indonesia to get to Australia. We were very effective in turning back the boats, and I actually applaud Tony Abbott's hard line. But I think we could have shown a little bit of respect for Indonesia and compassion for these people now, saying, well, look, they are absolutely stuck. Now we've walked away from Afghanistan. The Hazara people certainly can never go back home again. Their homeland's gone forever now that we've walked away from Afghanistan. So what on earth happens to their children? And the answer is basically they'll be destitute for the rest of their lives. Last year we took 41 Hazara people out of those camps in Indonesia, 41. And I just really think, as a businessman, I think we can do better than that.
Okay, that's good. Let's have a look here. Is Indonesia's underreaction to the slights that Australia has caused them, is the sort of thing we just talked about there, doing their political energy going into domestic politics? Is it down to, is it as a result of their political energy is going into domestic politics, as you'd expect? A big, huge country, 270 million people. So yes, maybe Australia's not much on their radar either. I mean, it in a sense behoves us more to have Indonesia on our radar because we're 25 million people, they're 270 million. But to what extent does Australia go onto the Indonesian political radar, given that disparity in population?
It's an excellent question. And in fact, during the asylum seeker boat people issue, It was on our front page of our newspapers every single day. Everyone would recall that. Basically, in Indonesia, no one even knew about it or cared. It was just, it was almost irrelevant. So, in a way, for all the wrong reasons, and because at the time the then president was preparing to retire from politics. So he's a politician, he wants to be, you know, he's got his eye on the United Nations, he wants Australia's help. So he wasn't about to upset Tony Abbott. So really Tony Abbott succeeded simply because of circumstances rather than because of good strategy. We were lucky and it worked, but the fallout underneath the radar continues, and it's mucky, and we should have done that better.
I'm just thinking, because occasionally, I mean, for example, think about I'm at a university, international students obviously is a huge issue. And as we know, over a decade ago, the Australian-Indian relationship really was under stress because of perceived, you know, actual attacks on Indian students, and then that seemed to get very large media in India. And so Australia was on the front pages, if you like, in India. So does Australia ever really loom large in Indonesian political discussion, particularly or not? Or are we always going to be just one amongst many countries they have to deal with, and China is the big deal, Indonesia? I mean, does Australia ever really loom large at all?
Well, I mean, at this stage, it certainly does not, and I think that's one of the issues. And I think as we hopefully build these closer to people relations, you'll see a greater interest start to evolve about Australia. Sadly, at the moment, we, you know, again, for the wrong reasons, we tend to be far less relevant to Indonesians. But I just want to qualify, though, that when they do surveys, the Lowy Institute in Indonesia, about what Indonesians do think of Australians, it actually rates quite highly, John. So in other words, they don't know much about Australia, but they don't have any real issues. We're a little bit the other way. We don't know much about Indonesia, but we do have some issues because they're not doing it our way. So that's part of the complexity between the relationship of two close neighbours.
Sure. You haven't talked about energy very much. I mean, as you know, we've got the hydrogen developments happening in the north of the state through Minister McTiernan and others. I mean, and I guess, again, these are ones that are probably not so much people to people. They're much more those big ticket items like you have in Australia and China with iron ore. But is that, if you like, a next big opportunity in terms of energy export?
Yeah, there's huge opportunities there. I might be speaking out of school, but Andrew Forrest has spent some time this year in Indonesia looking at a number of projects, geothermal projects. Indonesia has phenomenal opportunities in that area. One of the big challenges Australia faces is whether we've got the capital to put into these massive projects. Certainly with some of our companies like Andrew Forrest, there is the capital. But again, where we can play a role is in terms of supporting those industries, because we are a very sophisticated, advanced nation, and the needs of energy of this 271 million people as they evolve and move into a middle class, you're absolutely correct. It's absolutely huge, and it's right on our doorstep. So it's absolutely enormous.
Even if we're talking about, you know, the broad but shallow relationship, I mean, shallow can still be pretty valuable, as you've mentioned. I mean, and universities, again, taking a fairly parochial view here, I'm assuming there are some members of the Indonesian political and business elite who've been trained or educated in Australia, and I assume we also have, you know, Australian exchange programs, Australians. You know, the reverse Colombo plan, basically, those sort of things. To what extent is Indonesia seen as a priority in those? And is there anything, for example, that state governments can do as opposed to necessarily Commonwealth government in terms of trying to promote that? Because obviously, if you can get people at the top, it might well then flow down to other parts of society. Yeah,
and I think that's a very valid question. I think, in fact, under Julie Bishop, we had a renewal of the new Colombo plan, which is facilitated by a group under the acronym of ACHICHAS. Professor David Hill, that has done remarkable work, sending like 1,000 young Australians to Indonesia to study. They come back after 2 years and really can use that to build these commercial relationships. Likewise, when you go to Indonesia, I meet many young people, in their 30s that are directors of companies. These are Indonesians that have got their degrees here at Curtin or at UWA. So the alumni, is alive and well. But again, I'm not too sure whether we really squeeze that for everything that we've got to advance dialogue and openness, particularly amongst the younger generations. Old fellas, if I do say so, like you and I, we have a particular view, but as I mentioned to you, we've got 90 million people, under 30 in Indonesia. And when I go up there, I mean, these are people who are making apps and technology. These are young people that come on a Thursday before a long weekend, think, where can I go for a long weekend? And they jump on a plane to one of 70 countries that offer them free visa on arrival. Is Australia part of that? No, we're not. We don't get anything. It takes too long. And they just say to me, oh, Mr. Ross, it's too hard. And I think that feeds into what you're saying, is that what we need to do is make that easier. We want more young people to come down, talk with each other, form business partnerships. This is what our state government should be doing, facilitating young, energetic minds. I'm too old, but we really failed to take up exactly what you were talking about, those huge opportunities that our universities have played an enormous role in. And sometimes I look at I'm very close to the university sector, as you know, particularly at Curtin. Sometimes some of the actions our federal and state governments do, it's almost like they don't want to facilitate these opportunities for our universities. And I really wonder, it's a combination, I think, of just ignorance and arrogance towards a country like Indonesia.
Right. Okay, we're just about out of time and questions. But just one off the top of my head, what's happened to the plan to move the capital from Jakarta? Anything happening there?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's still very much there. President Jokowi, obviously he realises that in 20 years from now he probably won't be president. Well, he won't be. And the plan is still there. Look, there was a bit of politics in that, John. It is driven though by a sense of reality. Anyone who has lived in Jakarta, as I have, knows that during the wet season, it's just an unmitigated disaster. I've had a number of nights where I've slept on the floor of the Australian Embassy because the ambassador wouldn't let me use his bed. So I've actually slept on the floor of the embassy simply because I couldn't get home because there was a river outside the front door. So Jakarta's sinking. And at some stage, something needs to be done about that. So I think that was the genuine motive. But to move a city of basically 20 million people to a completely different location in Kalimantan represents a monumental challenge. And when you consider the other issues that this emerging young country have, it's a lot of work in progress.
Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Ross. It's been fantastic to catch up again, even if virtually, and to hear about Indonesia and Australia and WA's relationships with it. And we look forward with interest, and hopefully we can go back there one of these days once all the travel issues are out the way. So and COVID. So thanks again for your presentation, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks very much indeed, John, and to everyone out there, thank you for putting up with me and listening to me today. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege. Thank you.
Great, thanks. So, okay, before we go, once again, thank you very much for attending.